First thing I'd like to say is that the first group that met to begin what became Covenant Presbyterian Church was less than what you have up on the stage this morning. Some of you may not know, but our original name was the National Presbyterian Church. It began on December the 7th, 1973, and with all of the teaching elders that were willing to move into this new denomination, met at the Briarwood Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Alabama on December the 7th. And all of us who were there were offered the opportunity to sign a document. And I don't know if you still have it or not, a letter to all churches. It was something that was published in nationwide from New York City to Los Angeles. And it stated why we wanted and why we felt that we needed to form a new church. Well, unbeknownst to us, there was a church in Washington, D.C. called the National Presbyterian Church, and they threatened to sue us over the name because they were beginning a capital funds campaign and didn't want to have any intermingling of what was going on. And so in September of 1974, just 9 months later, the Second General Assembly of the PCA met in Macon, Georgia, and we changed our name, and that's when we officially became the Presbyterian Church in America. But even in those 9 months, there was a presbytery in South Florida. We call it the South Florida Presbytery. Then it was the Gold Coast Presbytery, had begun a major effort to start mission churches up in Central Florida. And in 1974, they called 5 men to start churches. They called Jim Bowen to go to Stuart, Florida, which he stayed in South Florida because that's where it is. Chuck Green was called to Orlando for the Orangewood Presbyterian Church. Jimmy Young was called to start a church in Grace Church in Ocala, Florida. And Dick Fisher started Faith Church in DeLand, Florida. And I was selected for the Melbourne area. By the way, a little side story here to take just a second. The call that was handed to me by the chairman of the committee at that General Assembly was written out on a dinner napkin. And it was an interesting part of the call, and you don't need to know all the details, but we essentially were promised that the presbytery would pay our salaries for 2 years, after which we were expected to be self-reliant mission with ruling elders and deacons, and would become particular churches instead of mission churches. And so most of you know it's not there anymore, but we used to use the Red Cross building for worship services at the amazing price of $5 a Sunday. Well, one of the things we did to maybe draw some attention and attract some new members or new folks to come to us during that time was we showed for 10 consecutive Saturday nights the video series by Dr. Francis Schaeffer, How Shall We Then Live? And we attracted one particular person who was a young lady that had studied at one of the conservatories of music in Paris, France. And while she was there, she met one of Dr. Francis Schaeffer's proteges, and he challenged her about her Christianity and how it was being lived out. And so she went to Le Brie, Switzerland, to their retreat for that purpose. And lo and behold, she comes back and settles in Melbourne, Florida. And she liked what we were doing, and eventually she became a church musician for us. In 1977, we actually became what you would call self-reliant. They could pay my salary, in other words. And we were self-reliant and elected our first ruling elders and deacons, and by the way, some of them are still here. Sometime later that year, a committee from South Florida Presbytery sent a committee on a Saturday afternoon to examine these men on their fitness to serve in that particular office, and I'm happy to say all passed. The next Lord's Day, we had a commissioning service and ordained those officers by the committee from Presbytery, and we were no longer a mission church, but we became what the Presbyterians called a particular church of South Florida Presbytery. In 1978, shortly after we did all of this, and there was a little Baptist church that was going out of business that offered to sell us their property, which we bought with some help from Mission North America. And in 1978, Covenant Presbyterian Church became original members of what's now called the Central Florida Presbytery, no longer under South Florida, but Central Florida. 1980 to 81, the church grew slow but steadily. But I, as the pastor, was somewhat concerned, and so I decided to take a week off to myself and pray and kind of cogitate over what God would have me do. And so I had, in my prayers, I came back to the conclusion, I was the problem. I decided that I was not doing what God wanted me to do, and He had somebody else in mind with the gifts and abilities that could take Covenant to where it is now. So I had more to pray about, because if I was going back to the church, I needed to have someplace. If I was not going to go back to Covenant, I needed to have someplace to go, and God put it on my heart that He would like me to serve in the military as a Navy chaplain. And there's a whole story as to how that came about. But in the spring of 1981, I moved to the U.S. Navy as a chaplain, and I think that move and those things were confirmed to me by the fact that in 2005 I retired from the Navy as a captain in the Navy. And look at what He has continued to do in this church right here. So we have both prospered in that regard. And I think this very building and what you've done over the years and what that you yourselves are confirmation that God knew what He was doing all along. And I'm grateful to God for His blessing both to His church and to myself. Solo Deo Gloria.